Hey, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and straight up warning on the front end here, this episode's going to feel different than what we usually do because I've got some things I want to get off my chest about transgenderism, climate change, and police violence. The thing that... I'm sorry? One sec. Got to reply to that. What? That's the most offensive text I've ever seen. It's so offensive that I can't even remember whatever it was that we were just talking about. You get offensive texts all the time from people who aren't trying to be offensive, and intuitively, you are able to sort that out because you understand the principle of autocorrect, and you understand how that error became introduced into your otherwise pristine text transcript. On this channel lately, we have been talking about the New Testament manuscripts from back in the day that support the Bible that you have in front of you now. And one of the things that we got to be super honest about is that with those thousands and thousands and thousands of manuscripts, you're going to have hundreds of thousands, 200, 300, some people would even say 400,000 points of disagreement between them. Some people would go so far as to say those are errors. I get it. You look at that, and if you're from the outside looking in, you're like, yeah, that's why I think the whole thing is ridiculous and stupid. I'm not basing my life on something that is rooted in 400,000 errors. And if you're a person of faith, maybe you look at that and you're like, what am I doing here the first time you hear that number? I am basing my life on this, and there's 400,000 errors? What the heck? I need to rethink everything. But the same common sense that serves you in understanding how an error in the text conversation made its way in because you're conversant in English and modern culture, that same intuition is really useful if we look into what those errors and conflicts actually are and how they made their way into the text. In this video, I simply want to talk about that. How did the conflicts in the New Testament manuscripts from back in the day make it in there in the first place, and what do we do with it? Of these 200 to 300 or maybe even 400,000 points of conflict amongst the New Testament manuscripts, a full 70% can be chalked up to grammar or spelling mistakes. Now, if I'm to be truthful, I'm not sure I know how to spell the word occasionally. I hate that about myself. I'm lazy because of autocorrect and because of spell check, but are there two C's? Is there an A and an I in there? I could have looked it up for this video, but that wouldn't be honest. I don't know how to spell it. There, now you know I'm a total fraud. But you know what? You're a total fraud too, because I bet you there's some word that you should know how to spell that you don't know how to spell. Hey, come on, even relatively competent people don't know how to spell everything. We have blind spots. What can you do? Well, these copyists who were doing this manuscript work back in the day were just like you or me. They had the occasional blind spot. See what I did there? I like that. And so they would screw something up as they were copying out of habit or just memorizing a wrong spelling of a word. But further, let's say they were better than you and me, and they didn't have any words they ever misspelled because they're so smart. Well, guess what? The Greek that was used in the New Testament is different than the Greek that was in circulation at the time that they were copying. I mean, that's hundreds of years for it to evolve. Think about how different English sounds from Shakespeare. That was just 400 years ago. These manuscripts, some of them are further apart than that. So what they did is we see spelling mistakes where they used more modern renderings of words in place of the old school version of Greek. The same way, if you were copying something from an older document where British use of the word color, C-O-L-O-U-R, was in place, you might just in your brain be like, oh, well, I want to make this make sense to the people I'm copying this for, C-O-L-O-R, good enough. Obviously, that does nothing to change the meaning, and 70% of these hundreds of thousands of errors or conflicts can be written off and diagnosed as simply as that. A second way that conflicts entered the original manuscripts is that we see evidence of copyists working on one thing, looking away, and looking back and skipping a section. Maybe the ending of a line over here on the original looked a lot like the ending of the next line, and so maybe they would jump ahead a line. Maybe a few letters at the end of a word looked like a few letters at the end of another word that was close by, and so they would jump ahead to that. There are 50 different ways that if you're copying one thing from another thing, looking back and forth, you could just lose your place a little bit and mess it up. If you go and do this exercise in English, it's really easy to figure out where you made a mistake. And the people who study Greek for a living have just as easy a time looking at those scribal errors and being like, oh, they just skipped a couple of lines, no problem there. That again accounts for a large percentage of the errors or conflicts in the New Testament manuscripts. A third way that some of these errors pop up in the manuscripts is that the scribes who did the work just aren't very good at being scribes. Like, look, they're all way better than I am. I'm sure they all knew Greek better than I do, but they just weren't as precise as some of the professional scribes. And so as a result, you see maybe some guys who didn't know Greek super well just imitating the shapes of the characters as they went along, not really knowing what they were writing down. And that is going to be detectable by a Greek expert looking back on it today. The same way, if you watch a movie with somebody who doesn't speak English and they have a line in English, they clearly just memorized the sounds of the words and the inflection's all wrong and off. You might tip your hat to that person for being brave enough to try it, but you can tell they don't really know what they're saying, and so it's a diminished quality of performance as you look at it. Again, here's the repeated theme. It's just as intuitive for a Greek scholar to look at these inferior copyist works and catch that. My watch is telling me that I am in the middle of a, quote, dynamic workout, which means that either my watch is completely broken or I'm a little bit animated. A fourth, and I think really fun and interesting way that some of these conflicts get introduced into the text is that scribes clearly came across a cluster of words that could be read and assembled in one way to have one reasonable meaning, or read in a slightly different way to have a different reasonable meaning. And it all just comes down to where you put the word breaks and the mental pauses. Check this out. For example, let's say somebody says to me, hey, could you get the doormat? Well, I assume that means you want me to open the door. I got the door, Matt. Or it could mean you want me to go and get this doormat. They both work. Well, again, and this is kind of a repeated theme, intuitively, you get that in English, and likewise, a good Greek scholar can figure that out in Greek. A fifth way that conflicts make it into the manuscripts is through the process of a scribe listening to someone dictate the text as they write it down. We know that this is one way that copying happened. And the thing about that is, sometimes you hear stuff that isn't there. This is going to be a little bit weird, but I want to talk about something uncomfortable for just a minute, and that's gay porn. And the reason it's uncomfortable to talk about is because of all of the maritime disasters that happened as people sailed around Cape Horn. In a room full of copyists where you sit there all day long listening to a dude read a thing to you and you have to copy it, surely someone is going to hear a word wrong here or there. And again, in the same way that you could understand that potential little mix-up, so an expert in manuscript work can detect those kind of auditory issues very easily. A sixth way that errors got introduced into the manuscripts was simply by notes in the margin or in between the lines of the text that copyists were making to interact with other copyists, accidentally being taken for part of the Bible by a future copyist. Now, it's very easy to sort that out in the same way that if you go to cakerex.com and look at ways that cake decorators screw up instructions on cakes, you can tell what went wrong every single time. Like if you look at a cake and the cake literally says, write happy birthday Henry right here in purple, you know that what it should have said is happy birthday Henry, and that the frosting should have been purple frosting. It's a copyist mistake, and it's understandable, and if you can figure that one out, you can also figure out what's going wrong with those manuscript errors. A seventh way that conflicts in the manuscripts are introduced is by copyists just making poor judgment calls. I read about, I think they call it Codex 109, where a copyist was drawing from a 2-column manuscript, and I think he was moving it toward a 1-column manuscript and how he was doing it. And he got it right throughout the whole thing, but he got to a genealogy section in Luke, and rather than continuing to read down a column and then down the next column, he read across. And so it completely scrambled the account of the family tree of Jesus. Mistakes like this, again, are glaring and easy to sort through. An eighth way, I think we're on 8, I don't know, something like an eighth way that errors get introduced into the manuscript is simply over the question of word order. If you've studied Spanish, you know that word order in Spanish is less important to the meaning of a sentence than it is in English. And Greek is the same way. So a lot of times we don't notice these word order mistakes where a Greek scholar or a Greek scribe, rather, would just order it the way it sounds right in their head, but it doesn't really matter. We don't notice that until we try to put it into English or a more rigid language where word order is really important. Ninth, so far all of the mistakes that we've looked at are accidental, but there are also some intentional changes to the text that introduce discrepancies. And the most common of those is for the scribe to try to help the text. Maybe they're looking at the Gospels. Those are the first 4 books of the New Testament that tell the story of Jesus, all kind of the same story. And they look at something from Matthew and they look at something from Luke and they're like, oh, well, it doesn't line up quite right. Here, we'll just help it real quick. And so they'll add a little phrase, again, nothing that effectively changes meaning in any of these examples, but a little phrase or a little addendum here or there to help it match up. Well, text critics have to be honest because their work is scrutinized, which means they look at that, and even though, hey, thanks, scribe, that does make the Bible look more credible, still can't lie about the evidence. And if that's the only instance we see of that, or if we can see a whole series of copies of that mistake, we still have to throw it out as being the wrong read, even though sometimes those wrong reads actually make the Bible a little bit more convenient and easy to look at. I think whenever people get to a place in life where we believe something so completely that we integrate it into our identity, that we build our worldview around it, that we defend it, that we put our reputation next to it, there is going to be a temptation, regardless of what you believe, to recoil at facts that don't seem to match with our presuppositions. And I know that there's a temptation when we look at the nuts and bolts of the Bible to be like, I like simple faith better. I like to imagine that God just gave us a Bible from somewhere and it's true and I can trust it and that's it. Well, you know what? I think it's true and I think you can trust it, but I think it's true and trustworthy precisely because of what happens when we dig into it honestly and look at the backstory. Are there errors in the biblical manuscripts or conflicts, whatever you want to call them? Yeah, tons of them. But you know what? It would be freakishly weird and scary and smack of falsehood if there weren't. I mean, think about the alternative here. What if we had 5,700 Greek manuscripts and another 20,000 or so in other languages after the fact, and they all said exactly the same thing? And we knew that anything that hinted at anything else was destroyed. We would know that there was some central power behind all of this, making Christianity happen, whether you want it or not. And there are moments in history that look like that in Europe. But that's much later than when these manuscripts start being around. Now, the fact that we see variety and human intervention occurring here, that we see spelling errors and normal people stuff, that we even see a few things that smack of slight regional preferences for how to say things, just says all the more this is a decentralized movement. And maybe there actually is a deity behind it. You don't have to think that to get along with me. You don't have to think that to be someone who's an honest thinker with eyes wide open, not faith, even as I pursue eyes wide open faith. The bottom line is this: I want to explain this stuff and do my best to wrap my own brain around it, because I want us to be in a place where the conversation is at least honest, and then we land where we land. Simply put, people are people, and the mistakes that they made when they wrote things and read things back in the day are a lot like the mistakes that we make today. It's not really that hard to wrap our brain around how those mistakes got there. But what I want to do in the next video I make is take us through the story of what we've done with that textual problem throughout the history of Christianity and the Bible. And then in the video after that, I know a lot of you have been interested in learning how to do this for yourself or in the sources that I'm using. I'm going to make a whole video to set you up to be able to tear into this on your own if you would like to. It's really interesting stuff. In the meantime, I'm going to hit pause there and we'll pick it up in the next one. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. I'll see you soon.